Two Treatises of Government is a work of political philosophy published anonymously in 1689 by John Locke. The first treatise attacks patriarchalism in the form of sentence-by-sentence refutation of Robert Filmer's Patriarcha, while the second treatise outlines Locke's ideas for a more civilized society based on natural rights and contract theory. Historical context: King James II of England was overthrown in 1688 by a union of parliamentarians and stadtholder of the Dutch Republic William III of Orange-Nassau, who as a result ascended the English throne as William III of England. This is known as the Glorious Revolution, also called the Revolution of 1688. Locke claims in the preface to the two treatises that its purpose is to justify William III's ascension to the throne, though Peter Laslett suggests that the bulk of the writing was instead completed between 1679 to 1680. According to Laslett, Locke was writing his two treatises during the Exclusion Crisis, which attempted to prevent James II from ever taking the throne in the first place. Anthony Ashley Cooper, 1st Earl of Shaftesbury, Locke's mentor, patron and friend, introduced the bill, but it was ultimately unsuccessful. Richard Ashcraft, following in Laslett's suggestion that the two treatises were written before the Revolution, objected that Shaftesbury's party did not advocate revolution during the Exclusion Crisis. He suggests that they are instead better associated with the revolutionary conspiracies that swirled around what would come to be known as the Rye House Plot. Locke, Shaftesbury and many others were forced into exile. Some, such as Sidney, were even executed for treason. Locke knew his work was dangerous. He never acknowledged his authorship within his lifetime. Publication history: Two Treatises was first published anonymously in December 1689. Locke was unhappy with this edition, complaining to the publisher about its many errors. For the rest of his life, he was intent on republishing the two treatises in a form that better reflected his meaning. Peter Laslett, one of the foremost Locke scholars, has suggested that Locke held the printers to a higher standard of perfection than the technology of the time would permit. Be that as it may, the first edition was indeed replete with errors. The second edition was even worse, and finally printed on cheap paper and sold to the poor. The third edition was much improved, but Locke was still not satisfied. He made corrections to the third edition by hand and entrusted the publication of the fourth to his friends, as he died before it could be brought out. The two treatises begin with a preface announcing what Locke hopes to achieve, but he also mentions that more than half of his original draft, occupying a space between the first and second treatises, has been irretrievably lost. Peter Laslett maintains that, while Locke may have added or altered some portions in 1689, he did not make any revisions to accommodate for the missing section. He argues, for example, that the end of the first treatise breaks off in mid-sentence. In 1691 Two Treatises was translated into French by David Muzzle, a French Huguenot living in the Netherlands. This translation left out Locke's preface, all of the first treatise, and the first chapter of the second treatise. It was in this form that Locke's work was reprinted during the 18th century in France, and in this form that Montesquieu, Voltaire and Rousseau were exposed to it. The only American edition from the 18th century was printed in 1773 in Boston. It, too, left out all of these sections. There were no other American editions until the 20th century. Main ideas: Two Treatises is divided into the first treatise and the second treatise. The original title of the second treatise appears to have been simply Book 2, corresponding to the title of the first treatise, Book I, before publication. However, Locke gave it greater prominence by inserting a separate title page, an essay concerning the true original, extent and end of civil government. The first treatise is focused on the refutation of Sir Robert Filmer, in particular his Patriarcha, which argued that civil society was founded on a divinely sanctioned patriarchalism. Locke proceeds through Filmer's arguments, contesting his proofs from Scripture and ridiculing them as senseless, until concluding party no government can be justified by an appeal to the divine right of kings. The second treatise outlines a theory of civil society. John Locke begins by describing the state of nature, a picture much more stable than Thomas Hobbes' state of war of every man against every man, and argues that all men are created equal in the state of nature by God. From this, he goes on to explain the hypothetical rise of property and civilization, in the process explaining that the only legitimate governments are those that have the consent of the people. Therefore, any government that rules without the consent of the people can, in theory, be overthrown. First treatise. The first treatise is an extended attack on Sir Robert Filmer's Patriarcha. Locke's argument proceeds along two lines. First, he undercuts the scriptural support that Filmer had offered for his thesis, and second, he argues that the acceptance of Filmer's thesis can lead only to slavery. Locke chose Filmer as his target, he says, because of his reputation and because he carried this argument jure divino farthest, and is supposed to have brought it to perfection. Filmer's text presented an argument for a divinely ordained, hereditary, absolute monarchy. According to Filmer, the biblical Adam in his role as father possessed unlimited power over his children, and this authority passed down through the generations. Locke attacks this on several grounds. Accepting that fatherhood grants authority, he argues, it would do so only by the act of begetting, and so cannot be transmitted to one's children because only God can create life, nor is the power of a father over his children absolute, as Filmer would have it. Locke points to the joint power parents share over their children outlined in the Bible. In the second treatise, Locke returns to a discussion of parental power. Filmer also suggested that Adam's absolute authority came from his ownership over all the world. To this, Locke rebuts that the world was originally held in common. But, even if it were not, he argues, God's grant to Adam covered only the land and brute animals, not human beings. Nor could Adam, or his heir, leverage this grant to enslave mankind, for the law of nature forbids reducing one's fellows to a state of desperation, if one possesses a sufficient surplus to maintain oneself securely. And even if this charity were not commanded by reason, Locke continues, such a strategy for gaining dominion would prove only that the foundation of government lies in consent. Locke intimates in the first treatise that the doctrine of divine right of kings will eventually be the downfall of all governments. In his final chapter, Locke asks, who heir? If Filmer is correct, there should be only one rightful king in all the world, the heir of Adam. Filmer must therefore say that men are duty-bound to obey their present rulers. Locke writes, I think he is the first politician who, pretending to settle government upon its true basis, and to establish the thrones of lawful princes, ever told the world that he was properly a king, whose manner of government was by supreme power, by what means soever he obtained it, which in plain English is to say, that regal and supreme power is properly and truly his, who can by any means seize upon it, and if this be to be properly a king, I wonder how he came to think of, or where he will find, an usurper. Locke ends the first treatise by examining the history told in the Bible and the history of the world since then. He concludes that there is no evidence to support Filmer's hypothesis. According to Locke, no king has ever claimed that his authority rested upon his being the heir of Adam. It is Filmer, Locke alleges, that is the innovator in politics, not those who assert the natural equality and freedom of man.